we're not really addressing loneliness very well in our health systems. And until now, clinical psychologists are not being trained around what loneliness is. We're just not being trained in this area.
Dr. H Lim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
This is a long overdue topic. I think I've done a Wisdom Wednesday on it quite a while ago, just in terms of a little bit of the impact of loneliness on longevity, but it was very, very brief. And I have been wanting to find somebody to do a deep dive on it because I think it's a massive problem. And I think it's something that's getting bigger, and that's the topic of loneliness. And I think you're very well qualified to talk about this. Given that, number one, you're a clinical psychologist, you work at the University of Sydney, but you're also the CEO of Ending Loneliness Together. And are you still the director of the Social Health and Wellbeing Laboratory?
Yeah, a group at University of Sydney, yes.
Yeah, cool.
Yes.
So tell us, maybe let's start there about that social health and well-being lab and, why you decided to get involved in that as a clinical psychologist. What was it that you saw or attracted you into this space in the first place? And then what do you guys do in that social health and well-being space?
Paul, I think that's a good start because I think, like many people who start off a career in one area sometimes find themselves, with a foot in another. And this is basically what happened to me. I was a clinical psychologist probably now for a good 20 years now. So it's been some time. And when I was training and also kind of the early years of being a psychologist, what I found was happening on the ground as a kind of practitioner on the ground was that social care really was not prioritized. It's really almost seen as an afterthought. It's almost seen as, we've kind of fixed all the physical and the mental health stuff. Right, let's discharge this person. And if that person's lucky, they might get connected into kind of more social activities and groups if they're lucky. And sometimes if they're willing. So it's almost like an afterthought. And increasingly, we're starting to realize in the scientific, part of the field that loneliness, so the subjective feeling of the stress that comes up for you when you feel your relationships do not meet your current social needs. It's a very subjective feeling. So it's not something necessarily a clinician myself can detect unless I ask. So it's something that is very internal and often very silent. We really just in science starting to realize it's not just being physically alone that's not helpful, because that in itself has got huge ramifications for mortality and health, but also just feeling like you're alone, not just physically alone. That on top of that has huge ramifications. But really, we're not really addressing loneliness very well in our health systems. And until now, clinical psychologists are not being trained around what loneliness is. And not just clinical psychologists, but generally all health practitioners. We're just not being trained in this area. And it's traditionally seen as a soft issue. It's traditionally seen as, she'll be right, it'll be fine. We get rid of this mental health issues, or we fix the physical health issues, and then they will not be lonely. But we're also realizing now that if people are more connected, if they're feeling like they have that meaningful social connections, they're more likely to survive. They're less likely to have other kind of morbidity of other kinds of problems. They're more likely to recover quicker. So, we're just starting to challenge that thinking that social health is not important, that we can just sweep it under the rug and it will just be fine as soon as we kind of address those problems.
I think part of that is that we don't really have a healthcare system. We have a sick care system. You look at the spending on government spending on health. I think something like 98.5% is on tertiary treatment, and we're not very proactive. How much of it is because of that, and how much of it is that the whole social health has been under-researched? And then how much of it is the fact that loneliness is actually subjective and it's not really a condition, so to speak?
Yes. Oh, very good questions. I don't know if I know the answer to it. I think I would speak more broadly around that. It's that you're right. I think loneliness is traditionally seen as that person's problem. It is your problem. You fix it. It's your responsibility. We're starting to realize now that, first of all, while it's not a pathological problem, if we ignore it and we neglect it and we don't actually address it, it becomes bad for our health. It stops us from getting better. That's where the problem is because we ignore it and we sweep it under the rug and pretend it's not there. And in fact, last year, when we did launch the State of the Nation report, people who did say that they feel lonely were just too embarrassed or ashamed to talk about it. And they actually actively conceal it. So like at least half of the people we survey, they actually conceal it. They don't tell you. They actively try to hide it. And this is a problem because I think the word loneliness right now still has this very negative connotation. But what we really are trying to change is that we need to let people know it is just a very normal signal for you to kind of do something different about your connections, that you're not really getting at the moment the connections that you need or that you really would like, and that it's not pathological, but when we ignore it, that becomes a problem. And so we really need to start that language around that.
And do people, in your experience, I don't know if you've asked them why they conceal it? Is it because of shame or stigma or
Yeah, absolutely. It's very much, the study also looked at misconceptions about what loneliness is. And people were holding a lot of misconceptions around that, thinking that this is something that if they knew more people, then they would just be less lonely. Perhaps even loneliness only affects older people. That's it. People who are lonely are not worthy of others, So you are holding all these misconceptions that have been probably cemented over the years with social media or kind of movies that kind of depict what loneliness is. And you're getting a lot of misconceptions of what it is, what it's not, and how do we actually talk about it and how do we deal with it. We now know this is not an issue that is soft. It's an issue that is now considered a health problem and really the next global health priority beyond COVID. And the World Health Organization just recently launched their commission, the kind of 3-year high-level commission on this issue. They're basically saying we need to reposition this issue because it's not just social isolation that's bad. Loneliness and feeling like you don't have those meaningful connections is just as bad for you as all the other things that we know are bad for you.
And so let's get into defining loneliness then. Is there an agreed upon scientific definition of loneliness that's out there?
Yes, I would defer to the Global Initiative on Loneliness and Connection definitions, which is really the working definition that we're using at the moment. And it is really around a subjective feeling of distress, where you desire particular relationships, but you don't have them. Be it quality, and sometimes for some groups around quantity. And I say quantity for some groups because young people, for example, desire more. They don't necessarily desire higher quality relationships. At this stage, they're still desiring more relationships and not really understanding that quality, is probably easier to focus on instead of quantity. And social isolation is really around the frequency of contact that you have with people. For example, we've met today and we're less socially isolated because we have met today and we have more social interactions because we're chatting, we're talking. It's something around the number of roles that you might have in the community, whether you spoke to someone that day, the number of connections you have. We do know that if you socially isolated, we traditionally already know that you're more likely to experience a range of different kinds of health problems as well. And sometimes the word social connection is being kind of tossed around, and what social connection is really an umbrella term that talks about less loneliness and less social isolation. So it's basically covering both ends, the quantity and the quality aspects.
Okay, cool. That makes sense. Just a little detour into the young people feeling like they want to have more social connections and not necessarily about the quality.
Yeah.
Has that changed over time? I'm just wondering whether the advent of social media and having lots and lots of friends has a kind of an impact on people thinking that they need to have more and more, the young people today.
Well, I think we need to do a lot of work here, actually, Paul. I think that I've run a lot of programs focusing on reducing loneliness in young people, and they will often come to me, and it's where their headspace is. They are prioritizing more. They are not necessarily prioritizing high quality. And so I really have to get them to focus on, you don't need to make a new friend, but I want you to focus on the quality of relationships that you already hold. And sometimes it's easier for young people, especially if they have kind of co-occurring mental ill health, and they find it quite overwhelming to make a new friend. And that's fine. This is about, changing strangers into acquaintances and, getting to know an acquaintance and potentially changing them into a friend. We don't need best friends. We just need to have more meaningful conversations about more higher quality relationships. Sometimes it's about focusing on the current relationship, like a primary caregiver kind of relationship, a grandparent, a sister, a cousin, focus on that. I think people often kind of put a lot of expectations on themselves and to say, oh, I need to change everything. You don't need to change everything. You just need to focus on one thing and one thing that you can do. So you feel successful, you feel confident, and then we build. It's something that we make sure that they have those realistic expectations.
I was just going to say, I would like to come back to that a little bit later on whenever we talk about the youth of today and the role of social media in all of this. But I just wanted to now talk about the incidence of loneliness. Like, how long have you been tracking it, or other people been tracking it? So what do we know? What is the data telling us about change over time, either in Australia or globally?
Yeah.
And then also about different age groups and the prevalence in different age groups. Take that in any order that you want.
One of the issues that we have with loneliness is the measurement of loneliness has been very varied across the years.
Yeah.
In fact, people do a really good job of measuring social isolation because, as I mentioned to you, something's a little bit more observable, and loneliness is a little bit more difficult because you have to ask that person, and then with the stigma that comes along with that, people underreport loneliness on top of that. And the varying data sets that I've kind of looked at across the world, and the ones currently right now are saying they're fairly stable, that it's always been there. It's just probably we're talking a lot more about it right now. Or where there's more awareness that we should be talking about this because this is just as important as social isolation. There might be emerging, post-COVID, I think there might be different data that might come up, but I'm not entirely sure about the stability of loneliness post-COVID. I think it's a little difficult to say because we do have to track them over a long period of time.
Yeah. I was going to say it's like when you're doing large scale surveys, they're not done every month, right?
No, they're not.
And we have to wait until we get a big set of data.
Yeah, and in fact, we still can't agree how loneliness is properly measured right now because there are measures that relate to some people across the ages differently. I know, for example, when I was working with adolescents, they didn't understand the word companionship when I asked them, do you feel like you lack companionship? And they said, I have no idea what that word is. So we're using a scale that's not really suited to them. They're going to just underreport loneliness. Same thing with, some of the scales that we're using. The interpretation of someone who's older versus someone's younger might be completely different. So we really need a standardized consensus definition as well as measurement. And that's what the World Health Organization is trying to do, is to kind of get this global social connection index to make sure that we're measuring the same thing. This is all great as well, but there's also some cultures that don't have the word loneliness in their vocabulary. So, it's one of those things that, it's important to measure, but there are cultures that will use the word solitude as a proxy for loneliness, but that's not the same thing because that's very much more being physically alone.
Yes.
So, there's a cross-cultural element that we also have to consider when we're doing these sorts of big index and measurements.
Yeah, and that just adds in a layer of complexity. I think it's kind of akin to measuring happiness, right? Because there's lots of different definitions of happiness.
Yes.
Whether you're talking about happiness, whether you're talking about human flourishing, whether you're talking about subjective well-being, and there's different scales for these sorts of things. So
you're right.
It's hard to get real data on it.
Yes.
But I mean, and if we talk about happiness. I very recently did a podcast with Dr. Tim Sharp from the Happiness Institute. And we were talking exactly about this. And he was talking about, well, flourishing is a better definition than just happiness. But looking into the flourishing research, there is a bucket load of stuff in there about social stuff, about social connectedness, social integration, social growth. It's kind of well recognized that it has a big impact on overall human flourishing. But in terms of you look at those happiness or subjective well-being, classic inverted U shape that we tend to see. And that's where people tend to be happier in their late teens. That's kind of the peak. And then it drops off and there's a nadir in people's 40s, and then they pick up again afterwards. Do we see something similar in terms of loneliness, or is it not that straightforward?
We see in some data sets a U-curve distribution. So you have high loneliness at both ends of the age groups. Though increasingly I'm seeing little bumps or blips in the middle ages as well, around the 45 to 54-year-olds, which I think is quite interesting. We don't really know the reason because that age group is really under research and we don't really expect much happening in that age group, but we're seeing a bit of a blip, especially in Australia, the 45 to 54 age group. So, but it's well known across the world.
I'll tell you what from an N equals 1 perspective, a big contributor there will be kids and kids sport, and every minute that you have spare is running around, dropping off kids, all of that stuff.
You have no time for your own social health. You
have no time for yourself. And then older parents, we're
caring.
We're kind of known, because I'm in that age group, we're known as the sandwich generation. Where you've got young kids and life's very busy, and then you've got older parents who are now starting to be riddled with disease or dying, right? So it's kind of known that has an impact.
That's right. That is
absolutely.
That's my hypothesized factors as well. And when I kind of look at those blips, and it could be also whether it's a change in career. We don't know what's happening as well on top of that. But it is having teenagers potentially and having aging parents and having to juggle. It's a difficult time to. You might have more resources, but you don't really in terms of time and other things that kind of get in the way. But self-care is at the ultimate low, probably.
I remember reading something around loneliness that particularly in divorcees, that we see much more loneliness in males who've become divorced.
Yes.
And the thinking around that was that a lot of the friendship groups of couples tend to be the wife's friends. And, that's a kind of a symptom from older times when the guy would be out working more and, the mum would have mother's group and all of that stuff, and then the school kids and stuff like that. And then when they're divorced, the wife ends up with more friends left than the male does, particularly if it's a nasty divorce. Have you seen that in your research, or is that just a blip?
We haven't specifically looked at divorced men, but what we do see is people who are single, divorced, or widowed are significantly more lonely. And it also tells us where people place the importance on intimate loneliness and on intimate relationship. And if they don't have that intimate relationship, they're really very much at risk of loneliness. And what you're saying, though, Paul, is very common for us to hear, that men are really very much at risk and also at risk of poor mental health when that happens, because it's a huge shock to the system. It's huge upheaval of their life, and they really have to repair during that time. And sometimes it takes a long time to really get back on their feet, especially if the children are not living in them. And particularly, that's quite a difficult time for them as well. So it's really important for us to think about how we can better support men who are going through that transition, because they're also at higher risk of, suicide attempts and very significant depression.
Absolutely. And so do we see, if we dive into the data, do we see sex differences across the ages?
Well, because loneliness is also underreported, we don't know if men are underreporting loneliness. But what we see in big data sets, when we do measure them in kind of big meta-analyses, is there's no difference in men and women. But there might potentially be a difference, I think, in social isolation in the Australian data sets that we're looking at. We do see that men are more socially isolated. And, social isolation could then lead to more loneliness down the track. So it's really important, I think, just in terms of thinking about men being at risk of that more being by themselves and not reaching out again. Men could be more at risk in that sense because they are after all more socially isolated.
And is there any indicators about why that would be?
Not
that men are more generally on the whole, why we're more socially isolated than women? Is it environmental? Is it the fact that men aren't as good as making friends? Is it busyness? Is it what is it?
Yeah, and you might not find the same trends in other samples, just to flag as well. We in this particular study, we did not follow up, but that was, I think it's interesting that, if they're not reporting more loneliness, are they underreporting loneliness? Because there's no difference when we look at loneliness, but we are more likely to hear that there's a difference in terms of the amount of social contact that they have with other people. Could be, a gender difference in the way we relate to people. We're not really sure. We haven't looked at whether that particular sample, for example, are more likely to, be, say, in financial distress, because that's also another element that kind of is very important and critical to understanding loneliness and social isolation.
I can see that it's a complex thing. And then let's talk about COVID. You've already said you haven't really seen anything because you haven't been studying
in long enough,
since COVID and being able to look at pre and post.
Yeah.
I'm just going to ask you to guess here. You know, you're pretty close to all of this. What's your gut feel? You're not putting your professional reputation on the line. It's just a gut feel.
I'm not going to deny that I think more people did report higher levels of loneliness during COVID, especially if you're in Melbourne. You really had to social distance in a very, very rigid way, which is something that I try not to think about. It's a bit of a trauma, I think, for everyone. And I think what we saw was blips of high levels of loneliness. But as things kind of have eased back and we've kind of gone back to kind of some level of normalcy, I think that people have this baseline that they just kind of reset and kind of go to where they were before. So it's almost like a slightly more... we see shocks in these sorts of experiences when we have an external event, and then we all kind of slightly do a reset. I think that's we see similar trends in happiness, I think, as well, that we kind of go back closer to our baseline.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I do have to say, though, that there are a lot of external factors. This is not always about the person's internal baseline. But there's a lot of external factors that can keep someone high in loneliness or feel persistently lonely. So once they become lonely, they stay lonely. And they are things that they often can't control. So things like the amount of resources they have, like financial resources, is a huge factor. The amount of money they have to be able to interact with people or to form meaningful relationships. The less money you have, the more likely you are going to be lonely. In large data sets that we see across the world, things like your socioeconomic status, employment levels, all those kind of big macro factors, If you have a chronic disease, you're more likely to also be lonely because you're probably spending a lot of time managing your disease. You don't have the luxury of, being able to drop everything.
And it's... Yeah, and I think it's probably inhibiting all your social activities,
Absolutely.
Right? If you've got some significant chronic disease, I can see how all of those things would play into it.
Yeah, and mental health, of course, as well.
Absolutely. And then it becomes this kind of almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, I would imagine, with mental health, whether it's social anxiety or depression. that then, I don't feel like actually going out and making friends, and that exacerbates the situation.
Yeah. And that is very common with people with mental ill health. But what we call the cognition of loneliness, even in people without mental ill health, is people who are lonely tend to, without realizing, unconsciously survey their environment in a much more threatening way. So I experienced my environment in a kind of more heightened state, in a kind of much more hypervigilant state. This is really based on a lot of social science and social neuroimaging studies, where they kind of scan the brains of people who are lonely.
Michelle, do they have enlarged amygdalas?
I think so. I can't remember from the back of with the studies that they're doing, but I think what they're really determining when they look at the imaging studies is that they're just much more hypervigilant. So it's possibly that. And when they're scanning, what they're doing is they're saying, I want to connect. So they're actually going, unconsciously, they're saying, I want to, but their brain is acting in a completely different way. And so what happens is that they actually do kind of much more avoidant behaviors. So they're not looking at, because, it's threatening material. You don't want to face it. You're basically trying to avoid it. So you're not looking at people when you're interacting. You're less likely to say yes to things. You're less cooperative because you're really trying to protect yourself. You spend a lot of time unconsciously trying to protect yourself from being rejected, basically. And of course, Paul, if you and I have a conversation and, I'm acting that way, you're thinking, what's going on with Michelle? Like, why is she so closed off? Oh, maybe she just needs space. Maybe I would just want ask her to have a chat then. I'm going to be annoying her. And so when you do that, then it just reinforces everything. Again, it just reinforces, Paul doesn't have time for me. I'm no good. He does, maybe I don't want to be a burden to him, so I wouldn't ask him. So it just goes round and round and round, and so a lot of the work as well is that when your loneliness is triggered, how do we kind of get out of this vicious cycle?
I think that is a huge component to it. Having read a lot of the research on imaging studies of people who are chronically stressed, whether it's from workplace or other stressors, we do see an enlarged amygdala. We see hypervigilance to threat, right? And that's exactly what you're describing, and a negativity bias. And I think this is really important for our listeners to understand, is that with that stress, whether that stress has been brought on by workplace stress or the stress of loneliness, that there does develop this hypervigilance that is a protective mechanism. It's an inbuilt protective mechanism to stress and threat that makes our brains become automatically more negative.
That's right.
Whenever we're looking around it. And as you say, wanting to then protect. And then I know from looking at those studies that when somebody has a brain that has been chronically stressed, when they see faces, the classic facial recognition, they see much more anger and much more sadness than people.
Even if it's neutral? Even if it's a neutral face?
Even if it's neutral.
That's right. They will perceive it as a negative face. So you're absolutely right. I think it's worthwhile noting this is not consciously done by the person who feels lonely. I think often they don't recognize, you don't know your brain's going, in the hypervigilant state, but we're doing this really in an effort to protect ourselves simply. We're not really trying to make our own lives difficult, because nobody really wants to feel lonely, but we just get into this mode. And so how do we get out of this mode? How do we start increasing our awareness that this is what we're doing? And most of the treatments so far, and the ones that have been evaluated, have always been kind of looking at kind of more cognitive behavior therapy kind of mode. And the problem with those ones is that it's always putting it back on the person who's lonely. But I think that if we want a holistic solution, we really need to think of solutions across different things, not just the person who's lonely, but also the people who are trying to help, our organizations in which we work in, our policies that affect the way we live, work, and play. The interventions and solutions are threaded across different kinds of platforms, not just the individual themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. But let's come back to that because I think it is worthwhile exploring a little bit more. But it's just, and this is a very non-scientific term, right? But when someone is depressed or anxious or feeling lonely, and they're in a social circumstance, that hypervigilance that you talked about in a negativity bias, they just give off a vibe that is not very welcoming. And I've had this conversation with my kids where they've talked about a certain individual just being rude, or we've thought that certain friends of our kids are rude, and then we actually realize they're just shy, right? And now, it's not a lot of shyness is social anxiety,
Yes,
right?
that's
But
right.
that whole thing that when you're shy or you have negative body language, people are less likely to go and interact with you, right? So it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. Whereas you look at someone who's happy and outgoing, I like to just talk about it, and it's not scientific, but it's their energy and the vibe that they're giving off is much more attractive to others than somebody who's feeling lonely or depressed or sad, that they're just not giving off the right vibes that are welcoming for other people.
And Paul, you're even pointing out some micro things that they don't know they're doing. You know, eye gaze is so important. But when you have social anxiety
Yes.
or when you are lonely, your eye gaze is poorer. And so you're really sending signals to people, you know, don't interact with me because, you know,
Yes.
you're already in that protective mode. Yeah, and it's so minor, but it makes a difference because people really take your cues. So
Absolutely. I think this is huge. In fact, you just reminded me, Michelle, I was doing some work with a business recently. It's a very large business, and most of the people, just because of the nature of the work, tend to be introverts. And I was having a conversation with the director of one of those things who's not an introvert at all. And they come from a completely different sphere of work. And they said to me, they said that when they joined, they noticed how many introverts there was. And somebody said to them, you know, you're talking to an extrovert in this business if they look at your shoes when you're talking to them and not their shoes.
oh wow,
Right?
that's pretty
But
funny.
it's that
Yes,
whole thing
yes.
that when people are introverted / shy / depressed / you know, that social isolation, that much less eye gaze and looking down, it's just sending out signals to the other person, whether right or wrong, but the signals incoming to the other person is, don't interact with me. I'm not interested. I don't want to interact with you.
Yes. And on top of that, I think that often when the person who's lonely does want to reach out, the other person just doesn't know how to respond. They don't know how to make it safe. And sometimes they take it personally, like, what do you mean by you're lonely? We're friends. What does it say about our relationship? They take it personally.
Right,
It's not
yes.
about that. It's not about that, you know. And loneliness and social anxiety are what we call bad partners in crime. You know, we do know from large data sets is that if you're lonely, you're more likely to be socially anxious. But if you're socially anxious at an earlier time, you're more likely to be lonely 6 months down the line.
Yeah, and good luck getting out of loneliness if you have social anxiety, right?
Yeah.
Unless you have really strong support groups
That's right.
around you, I would imagine.
And you know, people don't realize this, but social anxiety is one of the earliest onset of mental health difficulties that anybody would have, but the latest time to seek treatment. So early onset, I'm talking about 6, 7 years old, where kids start to go to primary school and they start having social anxiety. And what you will see are things like school refusal, separation anxiety. You see it displayed out that way because cognitively they haven't quite pieced that together. But the almost average time to get treatment for social anxiety is when you are actually going to university.
Oh, wow. Oh, so they have up to a decade where they're having this condition that is not being managed, dealt with, or helped
Well,
with.
you know what they have done is many people with social anxiety, which by the way, all of us have social anxiety. It's just we're talking about the clinical levels of social anxiety. We know how to live our lives in a way that we avoid those socially anxious situations. And I've actually seen adults in my clinic who have avoided giving talks, avoided any sort of presentations, you know, until they come and see me because they have to do a work presentation. They can't get out of it, you know, and some of these people have lived their lives in such a way that they have avoided every possible social situation, which puts them on the spotlight. They know how to do it. They got away with it, but at some point they just can't get away with it. And that's when they come to the clinic to see me. So it's just interesting to know that a lot of people were able to kind of navigate and build their lives in such a way that's safe for them for a very long time.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's talk about cognitive biases in psychopathology, because you just mentioned some of the cognitive stuff, and I know you have studied these cognitive biases. Talk about, first of all, what do you mean by cognitive biases in psychopathology? That really drew my eye, and then we can dig into it a little bit.
Yeah, and I put my kind of clinical psychologist hat on, and in traditional kind of cognitive behavior therapy, what we're really saying is basically they're maladaptive cognitions of how we see ourselves, the world, others. And it's really classified under about 10 to 12 kind of different kind of thinking areas that we have. Just to name a few, black and white thinking. There's no gray at all. It's like, it's either I'm a success or I'm a failure. There's absolutely nothing in between. All catastrophizing, just because he said this about me, it must be really bad, and so, or filtered thinking, there's one more. But filtered thinking is that we always see things only through the negative lens, and we're only picking up all the negative stuff. And the issues with cognitive biases or thinking errors, as I like to call them, to kind of make it more colloquial, is that they really make us feel negative, and then we act in ways that respond to those. Basically, we're trying to find information to fit that thinking bias. And they stem from beliefs about ourselves, or sometimes some people might call them schemas, that we need to hold true. So, for example, if I have a belief system that I am a failure for whatever reason, like I believe that I'm always going to be a failure, I'm going to fail at something, all my thinking errors are going to be very consistent with I am a failure, which is, oh, I did this right, but I don't know if I really did this right. Maybe it's a bit shit and someone's going to pick up that error. So that would be a thinking error.
That's right.
It fits my belief that I am a failure, so, and I feel bad, and then I will always kind of, unless I challenge myself, I will always just go round and round. And if I don't address that belief system, it's always just going to poke out its ugly head and say, hey, here I am. So as psychologists, what we're really trying to do is to correct their belief systems, because, again, a belief system of someone who's lonely might be, I'm not worthy of friendships, and all their thinking errors are just similar to that. Yeah.
And I think Daniel Goleman's work was this whole idea that self-talk drives your self-image, which impacts your performance, which then affects your self-talk. So with your example of that, and I often talk about this, is that people thinking, oh, I'm not good enough, that affects their performance. Yeah. And then, that affects their self-worth, right? And then that self-worth affects their performance. And then their brain goes, see, told you we're shit. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy,
we always try to find information to fit our belief. We will always do that, because if we find information that contradicts our beliefs, it feels uncomfortable. It's weird. It's like, oh, this doesn't fit right. And an example is if I am a failure and someone praises me, I'll be like, what are you talking about? No, I didn't do a good job. No, it was horrible. What are you talking about? You just straight away push it back.
Yeah. That person's just trying to be nice to me, and they're it's
it's
not
just
really
a fluke.
true.
It's just a fluke. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. We get into the 3 Ps as well here, don't we? The permanence, pervasive, and what's the other one? Permanence, pervasive. Anyway, what I think of the other one. Do you know what? As you were talking about those cognitive biases, it reminds me of a brilliant quote from Amit Goswami, who is an astrophysicist and philosopher. And he said that we do not view reality directly. We view reality through the mirror of memory. And it's that mirror of memory, the memories that create these cognitive biases. And we're actually viewing reality through this filter that's largely influenced by our past and these belief systems, right? And I think you very eloquently put out how that can then just impact people and keep them trapped in certain situations.
Yeah, and it's very similar to negative memories like trauma, and sometimes we wonder, why, if you're lonely, just go and meet people and you'll be fine, and trivialize it. But actually, maybe someone's got trauma, and they have the bad experiences of people. Maybe have bad memories of people, or bad like negative expectations of what might happen. It's not that easy to go out and make a friend. It's, you're trivializing it for them because this person comes with layers of complexity that you probably don't know anything about. So I think it often irks people who feel lonely when people say, oh, you're lonely, just do X. It's not that easy for that person just to do X.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like when someone's deeply depressed, right? Just go and do this.
Just get on with it. Yeah,
so
that's the solution.
I am, Michelle. I'm loving this conversation, but I am aware of the time constraints because you've got to be somewhere. So let's talk about the sort of stuff that we can do. So in your coalition to end loneliness, which I highly recommend that people go and look at, and we'll put all the links to at the end. But what are some of the things that people can do to either survive loneliness or to remedy loneliness? What are things that people can do themselves? And what about how can other people be more aware of the cues, and what can we do to help people who are struggling a little bit?
So starting from August 5th, what we will be releasing is really a variety of different videos around people talking about their experience. The reason why we're kind of really showcasing the lived experience is because we want people to know that loneliness doesn't have a face. It doesn't look like any particular person, that we all should feel lonely at some point and we all manage it differently. And to be able to hear and understand and normalize the experience can sometimes be quite liberating for people who feel lonely. And also, if you're not feeling lonely, it doesn't matter, because it's also about learning how you can help, but also understanding that at some point you will have to manage your own loneliness, because that can happen to us at any given time. And I think it's important for us to educate ourselves first, because when we actually understand what it is and what's not, we're more likely to take action and effective action. We're more likely to understand what works for us and what doesn't work for us. To have those moments of trying to work out, what kind of resources you have, what are your preferences at this stage of your life, what can you do, what do you not want to do, kind of taking those steps and reflecting so that you can actually help yourself and manage it so that it doesn't become a problem. And we need to think about the people around us. We're not an unsocial species, as I call it. We are a social species, that we will function with people around us and people that we care about. There will be people that feel lonely, that the people that we care about will feel lonely at some point. How do we have those conversations that is respectful, that is helpful to the person who needs the help?
Helpful, yeah.
Yes, because often people who want to help and very well-intentioned might trivialize loneliness in a way that makes people retreat more, makes people feel more helpless. So we can start learning how to have that conversation. Just people listening to this podcast at the moment, how can we start having a healthier language around, connection? How do we encourage people to connect as opposed to withdraw? Because remember, we're already working against a system that's silent in our brains. This is not as easy as it sounds. So how do we make the environment safer for people to talk about their loneliness in a way that they don't feel judged, or they don't feel like they're being demeaned, or that they're less worthy of you?
Yeah, I think that is definitely great advice. I mean, what springs to my mind when you were talking there was about, and I often tell this story when I'm doing corporate talks, was the Hanoi Hilton prison camp in Vietnam, which was completely brutal. And some of those guys spent 3 to 4 years in solitary confinement. But they had this thing called the tap code, where they could tap out the letters of the alphabet on the wall and the pipes to communicate with each other. And I interviewed a guy, Lee Ellis, who spent 5.5 years in that prison camp. And he said it was the tap code was the glue that held these guys together. That just, when I think their leader said, when your brother is taken out of his cell to be tortured, when he comes back, you get on the wall, you tap to him, you tell him that you love him, you tell him that you're here for him. And Lee told me that it was just, somebody tapping to them that actually helped them to get through their darkest hours. And it's very powerful. And I always say to people, if you've got your own shit sorted, look out into your little corner of the universe and think to yourself, who could use the tap code, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also, equally, if you're struggling, is trying to find the courage to reach out to someone.
That's right.
And I think a really important thing is that people who are lonely or depressed or have some sort of mental health issue, they often don't reach out because they think they're going to be a burden. And what we now know is that when someone helps somebody else, that it activates feel-good chemicals in their brain, right? And so this is what I say to people, you're not being a burden, you're just giving somebody an opportunity to improve their mental health.
That's exactly
by connecting and helping you, right?
Yes, yeah. I often say, don't deprive someone else from help because they want to help, so it's actually an opportunity for the person that's the helper as well. Yeah. But it doesn't, again, when we're talking about all these things, it's about, knowing that you can be on either end of the spectrum at any given time. I could need the help at some point and I will be the helper at some point. So those roles change all the time.
Yeah. And look, there's a beautiful word that comes from Japanese psychology. And they talk a lot about anxiety and social anxiety. And it's called arugamama. And it basically means with things as they are, what needs to be done. And it's a very aligned with ACT, which I'm sure you're familiar with, acceptance commitment therapy. And it's basically taking action that is aligned with your values that's going to take you towards the person that you actually want to be. And, this stuff isn't easy, but when people think deeply about their values and how sitting with the discomfort is actually going to help them live the life they want to be, I think it's helpful in finding the courage to take those steps.
Absolutely.
So, Michelle, where can people go to find out more? So I know you got a couple of websites, but where's the best place to point people to where they can get resources?
Yep. So lonelinessawarenessweek.com.au is one, but also endinglonelinnesstogether.com.au is another as well. So being able to find lots of resources and support. We have videos and tip sheets and resources for people who are interested in kind of much more the scientific stuff or the kind of policy recommendations. We also have lots of things like white papers as well that they can kind of, understand what's the latest in terms of how people are thinking about this issue, both from a scientific point of view, but also a policy point of view. So lots of different resources. And, if people are keen to share their stories around loneliness, they can definitely submit a story about this as well through a portal, and that those sorts of things are available from the 5th of August.
Okay, brilliant. So I'd encourage all the listeners to go and jump onto it, to look at End Loneliness and End Loneliness Awareness Week. Was it .com or .com.au?
So Loneliness Awareness Week is lonelinessawarenessweek.com.au and endingloneliness.com.au.
Okay, awesome. And so, this podcast is coming hot on the heels of a happiness podcast. So just real encouragement from people. They will have heard about the importance of social connection in terms of that happiness thing. So I think, getting back to the Hanoi Hilton analogy, no matter what side of the wall you're on, whether you're struggling or whether you're okay, it is about going and getting on the wall and looking at those resources and just seeing what you can do.
Thank you for having me, Paul. It's a lovely conversation to kind of talk about loneliness and making sure that we set the conversation straight.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle, and keep doing your awesome work.
Thank you.